Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about how to win a tournament with the Aeldari, or at least how to properly prepare for one. However, I do want to lead this video off by saying that tournaments aren't for everybody, and that's not a bad thing. You know, I think this hobby is very diverse, and it brings in a very diverse group of people who enjoy it in different ways, and you know, playing in tournaments isn't everybody's goal. And that's totally okay. You know, some people just don't like tournaments. I have quite a few friends who, play the hobby. They're good players, but they just don't like tournaments because, they really don't like the pressure of a tournament. They really don't like to, kind of spend all day playing game after game after game. And in general, they like to take their time with their turns. They like to goof around, talk, and stuff like that. It's more of an experience, and it's more of kind of a hangout for them than anything else. And I have to be real with you guys. Most of my games are like that. When I go into the hobby store or when I go to a buddy's house to play a game, I would say at least 80% of the games I play are, kind of more semi-competitive. Maybe we're playing with competitive lists, but we're playing in a uncompetitive way. We're just joking around. We're not really worrying about time or anything like that. And, for the most part, that's how I enjoy my games. However, as most of you guys who have played in tournaments know, you can't exactly take your time and play like this in a tournament setting. I mean, of course you could, but you're probably going to run out of time, not finish your game, and then end up, probably doing pretty poorly or just not having a good experience in general. So, I wanted to make this video to kind of walk you guys through how to at least prepare for a tournament and prepare to be successful. Because I think what a lot of it is, you do have to obviously know what you're doing with the army, but the other part of it is preparation. And what separates really good players from really good tournament players is how they manage these different things. And to give you guys a quick little background into my own past tournament experiences, when I first started playing in tournaments, I was very much, a slow player. I spent a lot of time thinking about stuff. I wasn't really prepared. I didn't exactly know what I was going to be going up against, all that preparation stuff I didn't really care too much for. And as a result, I did really poorly. So what I'm hoping to do in this video is just kind of walk you guys through the steps on how to prepare for a tournament, and then furthermore, prepare for success. So what we're going to be looking at in today's video is all the initial preparation and research that one must do before, entering a tournament, especially with the Aeldari being such a high skill cap faction. We're also going to be talking about building a tournament winning list and all the factors that, have to be there for it to be effective. And lastly, we're going to be talking about play testing and adjusting your list accordingly. Because just like anything else, when you do finally put that list on the table, there's probably going to be some things that you might want to swap out or, optimize. So we're going to be talking about the steps in which to take to do that as well. All right, so what is the initial preparation and research that one has to do before entering a tournament? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the helpful tools to bring with you when you're going to a tournament. We're going to be talking about terrain format and lastly, understanding the meta. All right, so what are some tools you can bring with you to help your tournament experience along? Well, like I said before, tournaments are timed, right? You usually only get about 3 hours per game, which may seem like a lot, but in a timed setting, in a noisy setting, that may actually be a little bit, easier said than done. Especially when you're getting into either rules discussions with your opponent or, discussing line of sight and different things like that. So the first thing that everybody should bring with them is a laser line for drawing line of sight. This helps resolve disputes quickly. So there's no, eyeballing it, getting down to the table and stuff like that, So that honestly is a huge time killer, right? When you're arguing over line of sight. A laser line will solve this for you. And most people that I know that are pretty serious about tournaments always carry these along with you, and you probably should as well. They're not very expensive either. You can probably pick them up for about $5. Really not that, much money. So definitely pick one up if you plan to go to a tournament. The other thing you should look for is a 1-inch or 2-inch measuring tool for engagement range and unit coherency. especially with some models, and I have to say, especially with some Eldar models, it's really hard to actually measure with the measuring tape engagement range sometimes. And, sometimes there's like a little bit of an argument, like you're out by a millimeter or something. And now in a casual game, if I was out by 1 millimeter or my opponent was out by 1 millimeter, I would just totally give that to him. I don't care, right? If it's close, it's fine. But in a tournament setting, players are much less likely to actually give you that. I know that a lot of players out there, say, I went to a tournament and everybody there was great and we kind of just played to have fun. But, that's awesome, but you're not always going to get that person. Sometimes you will go against somebody that will call you out on that kind of stuff, especially engagement range, right? Charge ranges and things like that. So having this measuring tool is pretty good, because you can basically just easily tell if something is in engagement range or not. So definitely that's good to have as well. And I learned the importance of this when I used to play a lot of War Machine. War Machine was big on unit coherency and engagement range and things like that. And, Warhammer is now becoming that. So, definitely have one of those tools with you as well. And of course, I think the last most important thing to have is a printout of the rules commentary or FAQ to resolve confusing interactions. So an example that I like to go to is something that actually confused a lot of the community when I did a video on it, which was Wind Riders. And I had kind of assumed that when GW came out with the FAQ regarding Locust Destroyers for the Necrons, basically, if you guys don't know, Locust Destroyers have the same exact ability as Wind Riders, which is they reroll ones to hit against the nearest enemy unit, but if the target is on an objective, then they reroll all hits. So my understanding of it was that it's not mutually exclusive. You don't need to satisfy the first part of the rule to get the second part of the rule, and GW confirmed that with their FAQ on Locust Destroyers. So basically, regardless of whether or not that unit is the closest unit, if it's on an objective, you get to reroll all hits against it. However, this can still be kind of confusing. GW probably still should fix this, but the FAQ for the Necrons clearly states that abilities that are worded like that work like that, right? So if you're using Wind Riders in your list, that's probably something you should have just in case. The printout of the FAQ, the Necron FAQ, and maybe the printout of the Locust Destroyer ability, the printout of the Wind Rider ability, just to make sure that, if you are called out on it and a TO comes over or judge comes over, you can have a quick reference guide. That's always definitely going to save you not only a bunch of time, but also possibly a rules decision, because you don't want to be on the wrong end of a rules decision is right, but because the judge maybe doesn't have all the information available to him, then, you get the wrong end of the call. And of course, not mentioned here, but I think the last thing that everyone should obviously have is a tape measure and dice, right? And you want to make sure you have enough dice for all of your units. What I like to do is I also like to get multicolored dice so that my fast rolling can be a little bit more efficient as well. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the terrain format at the tournament. So terrain is a key part in being prepared for a tournament, and knowing what setup you're going to be playing on is pretty vital to any kind of competitive preparation. And the most common terrain layouts you're probably going to go up against are WTC terrain layouts, Leviathan terrain layouts, and of course player place terrain. And the terrain setup is going to determine which units will be effective and which ones you should probably leave at home. So WTC, for you guys who don't know, is the World Team Championship. And they're basically a big Warhammer organization for, organizing tournaments and stuff like that. And they have their own rules and terrain setups. So if a tournament is considered, WTC abiding, then, they're going to have certain stipulations for armies. They're going to have their own FAQ and their own way of dealing with rules interactions that are maybe a little vague. But of course, they're also going to have their own unique terrain layouts. And they're known for having very dense terrain layouts that fully block line of sight from one board edge to the other. They have 3 different kinds of terrain layouts in general. They have light boards, which, light by their standards isn't really light. It's still pretty heavy, but there is maybe 1 or 2 line of sight lanes from one board edge to the other. They have a kind of medium density terrain, which is, there is no line of sight from one board edge to the other, and it's pretty dense. And then they have, of course, have fully dense terrain layouts that are just absolutely covered in ruins. And there's barely any lanes of line of sight, not only across the board, but also in the midboard as well. There's just not very many lanes of shooting available. And typically in these types of terrain layouts, very large models or models that rely on very long-range shooting like fire prisms are not as effective on them. And the other thing I want to mention is mounted units that are, more combat-oriented are going to be much, much worse on these types of boards, because not only are they all ruins, but they're very dense ruins. So there's rarely going to be a good opportunity to get a good charge in against opponents who know what they're doing and know how to place their models. So for example, if you bring a unit of Shining Spears to the battle and it's WTC terrain, for example, and they have, a dense terrain layout, then your Shining Spears would be pretty lucky to get any charges off, let alone one that is going to make up their points value. So that is something you have to consider as well, is that, combat mounted units are going to be much, much less desirable on these types of boards. On the other hand, though, infantry that is assault oriented is going to be much better, especially if it has something like Fights First. Due to the fact that usually the bottom story of the ruins on WTC is considered opaque and fully blocks line of sight, whether there's actual windows there or not, which means units like, the Vizarch with Harlequins, or perhaps even Howling Banshees, especially with their new points cut, might be a little bit more desirable because of that strikes first and because there's a lot more terrain. The next terrain layout is Leviathan. This is Games Workshop's standard terrain layouts for 10th edition. The terrain is, I would say, of medium density, but arranged in such a way where shooting from one board edge to another is possible. So, you can basically, from your own deployment zone, see the enemy's home objective in several of the terrain layouts, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, but, some players don't really like that because it gives, the side that gets first turn a little bit of an advantage if they have some heavy firepower. Generally, though, most types of units are viable in this setup. Rules dependent, of course, obviously some units are going to be better than others, with the exception of super heavies. And super heavies are still one of those units that are a little bit iffy, even on Leviathan terrain setups, because of the fact that they have a large footprint. Now, the units that are going to be okay on this kind of terrain setup are things like Wraith Knights, things with those large oval bases are typically okay. Imperial Knights, Chaos Knights, stuff like that. But, bigger things like Bane Blades might have a little bit of trouble maneuvering. As for the ruins themselves, there are some ruins on these types of terrain layouts which are multi-story and maybe do have an opaque bottom story. That is tournament dependent, whatever the tournament organizer has set up for that specific event. But there are some pieces that might be considered obscuring terrain, but they don't physically block line of sight. So that's also something you do have to look out for. The last type of terrain is player placed. Players basically take turns placing terrain, typically about 14 pieces divided up. This leaves room for some unique terrain interactions and room for larger units like super heavies to deploy more easily. This is a very popular type of deployment and terrain setup due to the fact that players have a little bit of control over where they place the terrain. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of this type of terrain setup where players take turns placing it. I sometimes feel that this can get a little bit, crazy and wild. But I have to say it is interesting. It does keep things fresh. I just happen to be more of a fan of, if I'm going to prepare for a tournament, I want to know what types of terrain I'm going to be dealing with. Okay, so the last thing in our preparation step is understanding the meta. Now, a lot of people might argue that, understanding the meta is the least important thing to, kind of learn when you're going into a tournament, but I would actually disagree. I think in general, players kind of adhere to the meta if they want to win and stay competitive. And whether we like to admit it or not, as players, if we're going into a tournament, we not only want to have fun, but we go in it to win to some degree, right? When we're going into a tournament, we want to do our best, we want to win, so we're going to bring good units, or units that we at least have a lot of experience playing with. So understanding the meta is an important part of this. And don't get me wrong, I don't think that every player goes into a tournament with the mindset of taking the most meta, kind of hardcore lists. But it's something you should know because there are going to be a substantial amount of players that do bring these types of lists. So you want to be prepared. And essentially knowing which armies are commonly taken in your area and which units are primarily taken in competitive lists for those armies can really help inform you for building your own list. Currently, the meta in general, at least in my area, is, lots of heavy infantry. Orcs is also starting to make an appearance, or so I hear in my local game store. People are excited to play the new Orc Codex, and they're bringing out their Orcs once more. And of course, aside from that, people are still running pretty heavy vehicles. There's a couple players still kind of running the big Death Star units that were very common in the beginning of the edition. Just because they didn't really want to change their list after they initially made it for 10th. So that is still a thing. Now, the skew lists that you might come across in this, current heavy infantry meta include swarm infantry spam like Imperial Guard and Tyranids, amongst others. So when it comes to skew lists, you're probably not going to have the ideal army composition for it, but you should at least make sure you have a couple of tools here and there to be able to deal with it if you do get matched against it. Again, it's one of those things, it's very rare, might only happen to you 1 out of, maybe 5 games, but you should have a composition that, if it can't kill it, should be able to at least play into it fairly effectively. All right, so now that we've kind of gone over some of the preparation, let's talk about building a tournament winning list. So all tournament winning lists will have the following types of units in their armies. So secondary specialists and army enhancers. They will also have primary specialists, and lastly, damage specialists and utility units. Secondary specialists are units that are very fast and reasonably expendable, who can also perform actions to score secondary objectives. And that's where the speed comes in. Being able to get to certain places in the board quickly enough in the matter of 1 turn in order to score secondary objectives. Right? Slow units are not able to get to certain places in the battlefield quick enough to be able to do this, unless they just happen to be nearby. So typically armies will have these units so they can score secondaries quickly. The other type of unit that will probably be needed in your army is army enhancers. These are units that improve the performance of your army or grant it additional resources. Things like the Autarch Wayleaper, for example, that's pretty much a staple in every Eldar list because it improves your army's resources. So typically a strong Eldar list will have between 4 and 6 secondary specialists and between 1 and 2 army enhancers. So your secondary specialists are probably going to be things like Swooping Hawks, Shroud Runners, and maybe even Warp Spiders, right? Even though Warp Spiders are more expensive, they're kind of one of those units that's really good at secondaries, and they're also very effective at board control because of that good overwatch that they have. And at this point, you might be asking, well, Proxy Hammer, why do we need so many secondary specialists if I'm going to a tournament? My list does just fine, and it only has 2 units of Swooping Hawks, or, 1 unit of Swooping Hawks and 1 unit of Warp Spiders, and typically I do all right on secondaries. Why are you saying that you need 4 to 6 units of these? And the reason why I say this is because this is an insurance policy. In tournaments, players are going to be aware that Eldar are very good at scoring secondary objectives, and they're going to do everything they can to kill off your Swooping Hawks, your Warp Spiders, your Shroud Runners, etc. So if you only have a couple of secondary scorers, and your opponent eliminates these within the first turn, or maybe, the first couple turns of the game, you're going to be in trouble for the rest of the game. So that's why I say, bring more secondary scorers. Our secondary scorers do have other roles as well that they do well in. So you're not just using them for secondaries, but it's good to have them just in case, your opponent tries to single them out, because you definitely don't want to run out of them in the first couple of turns of the game. The next type of unit that's going to be common in tournament lists are primary specialists. And primary specialists are very tough or hard to kill units that are effective at holding objectives, and they need to at least be tough enough to hold it for 1 whole round. Now, typically an Eldar list will have 1 to 2 of these units for holding objectives. However, we are starting to see more lists slanted towards pure damage, relying on lone operatives and revive mechanics to secure objectives instead. So things like the Autarch Wayleaper with a Phoenix Gem, being both hard to target because of the lone op and also being able to revive himself. Same thing with Fuegan, being able to revive himself, right? And also having a really good armor save and feel no pain makes him just tough enough to where most, small arms fire is not going to be able to reliably take him out. And then, of course, instead of spending a bunch of points on things like Wraith Blades and the Avatar of Cain to hold primary objectives, you instead pump more points into damage dealers who can remove enemy units from the board and thus give your weaker units a little bit more breathing room to, actually capture those primary objectives. And I'm definitely not saying that that's the only way to play Eldar, but of course that is something that is, kind of rising to more prominence after the balanced data slates nerfed our, tougher units. The last 2 types of units are damage specialists and utility units. Damage specialists, of course, are units that are effective at destroying enemy units to reduce your opponent's battlefield presence. Utility units, on the other hand, specialize in other tasks such as screening, infiltration, debuffs, or sticky objectives. Typically, your army will have a couple of these here and there to perform those various roles. And in reality, you're probably going to always want at least 1 infiltration unit as the Eldar. Not every army needs that, but the Eldar definitely do because the Eldar don't like getting backed into a corner, right? We're a very mobile army, and thus we need a lot of room to operate on the battlefield. So having an infiltration unit like Rangers or Scorpions is going to be very important. Now, lastly, there is something that I do want to mention, and that is that some roles may overlap, as many of the units in our index are actually quite flexible and can serve multiple purposes. So a lot of our units, that I talked about earlier for secondary objectives are also utility units as well. Shroud Runners are a secondary specialist, but they're also great utility because they have a scout move and they have the ability to not only screen, but also debuff enemy units as well with lethal hits. So basically every unit that targets that enemy unit is now going to get lethal hits from the Shroud Runners. Very powerful ability, and it makes a lot of our, kind of high volume, low impact weapons able to deal significant damage even to tough targets. But the same thing goes for our damage specialists as well. One example of this is Shadow Specters. Shadow Specters are, of course, a great damage dealing unit, but they're also a multi-purpose unit because they have the mobility to score on secondary objectives. So there are a lot of units in our army that can do multiple things, and you just need to be aware of that in order to make a successful list blend really well together. All right, so having said that, I want to give you guys an example of a list that I made that I think fits all the criteria of a competitive Eldar list. So this is going to be more of a balanced competitive build. I'm not going for any kind of skew or anything like that. This is going to be a balanced Eldar list at 2,000 points. For my characters, I decided to go with an Autarch Wayleaper for my army enhancer, of course, to give my army more resources. Now, as of late, people have been discussing the possibility of perhaps even dropping the Wayleaper altogether, going with the cheaper Autarch, or dropping the Phoenix Gem. Now, there is a reason why I decided to keep this on here. It's not just force of habit. It's because the Autarch Wayleaper with the Phoenix Gem is a good model for playing the midboard and scoring on primary objectives if the rest of your army is built around it. So, for example, if you don't have a big brick of Wraithguard or an Avatar of Cain or anything that can stand on an objective for, a couple of rounds, you probably need something that can kind of fill that role, and the Autarch Wayleaper does that, but you need to give him the Phoenix Gem. So despite the 10-point increase, I decided to still include the Autarch Wayleaper in my list. I also have Fuegan, and Fuegan is just a good character in general, very solid damage, both in melee and at range, and is hard to kill because of that 2-up revive. And again, this is another character that kind of doubles as a primary objective scorer in this particular list. And the simple reason that characters with revive mechanics or lone operative are good at holding primary objectives is because your opponent has to physically put their models on said objective to actually be able to control it or, prevent you from getting the points for it. And in this particular Eldar build, I'm going to make it as hard as possible for my opponent to do that by, providing a bunch of damage dealing units and screening units for my opponent to have to deal with ahead of time. Not only that, but I also am going to give many of my objectives sticky with a unit of Storm Guardians. So Storm Guardians recently got a points decrease. I thought they were good before. They do provide utility in that sticky objective, which is going to be very important for an army that doesn't have a lot of, really tough units to hold down objectives. It doesn't have Wraith Blades, doesn't have the Avatar of Cain. So I'm really going to have to rely on being very mobile, very aggressive, and for that type of playstyle to work, you need sticky objectives. It's the same reason why units like Orc Boys, combat-oriented units have sticky objectives typically, because they don't want to be sitting on an objective all game. They want to be moving forward, engaging the enemy. And most of our army is essentially going to be wanting to do this. So Storm Guardians to me just seem like a perfect fit in this type of list. They also happen to be a very good screening unit, and, this army does need all the screens it can get, especially when we're relying heavily on, the Autarch Wayleaper and Fuegan to score primary objective points. For other data sheets, we have 2 units of Dark Reapers. Now, Dark Reapers are there because they need to put pressure on enemy backfield units. Units like cultists, stuff like that, because we want to basically pin our enemy down. We don't want them to feel comfortable. We want them to feel under threat at all times, and Dark Reapers do a really good job at this. If there's a unit of cultists, Imperial Guardsmen, Gretchen, anything like that, Dark Reapers will be able to shred them in a couple of turns. So before your opponent starts scoring primary objectives, those models should be dead. Or your opponent is going to have to waste a lot of resources keeping them alive. Command points for defensive stratagems and so forth. And in the case of the Imperial Guard, precious orders. So that's going to reduce the effectiveness of their basilisks. Their indirect fire are not going to be able to take aim as easily. And eventually, you're going to shoot through all those models and make it much harder for, Lord Solar Leontis and so forth to be able to issue orders. Because without that Master Vox, you're going to get orders at a much fewer inch range. We also have 2 units of Fire Dragons in this list. Now, the cool thing about Fire Dragons is they are just really good at killing heavy infantry. That's kind of the meta right now. They didn't get a points increase or anything like that, so they're still solid. And on top of that, they're also very good at dealing with vehicles out of a Falcon. We are going to have these in a Falcon, but we have a little bit of, a couple of tricks up our sleeve when it comes to what we're going to be putting in our Falcon in the beginning of the game. But of course, I also feel like Fire Dragons act as a deterrent unit as well, because they can disembark 3 inches, they can move, and they can of course shoot as well. So they're basically getting out of the Falcon about 10 inches, and then they can shoot, up to 12. And then if they want to do some extra damage, they need to be within 6 inches for Melta. But that's often going to be very possible if your enemy is playing very aggressively. If your opponent is, of course, playing more defensively, you can always move the Falcons up to protect the Fire Dragons and, stage them for future turns. And Fire Dragons are one of the examples of just a damage specialist. That's basically their whole goal, is to deal damage, remove enemy units from the board so that your opponent doesn't have as much board presence. And of course, to carry the Fire Dragons into battle, we have a couple of Falcons. The reason why I have Falcons is basically to counter any 3-inch deep strikers, that want to harm the Fire Dragons early on in the game. Things like Inceptors are really good at taking out Fire Dragons, especially if, they're going to be armed with the bolters and things like that. So keeping them in the Falcons is going to make sure that those units cannot, easily pick off the Fire Dragons. In response, if your opponent goes after other units in your backfield with those Inceptors, the Fire Dragons will then come out and clean them right up. And of course, on the offensive, Falcons are really good with Fire Dragons because they have the combination of tank shock and grenades. A lot of people don't realize this. Fire Dragons have grenades, guys. So you can use the grenade stratagem, shoot your, fusion guns, and then of course tank shock with a Falcon. And you can end up doing a lot of more wounds in damage on top of their already insane damage numbers. All right, so onto our other units, we have a unit of Howling Banshees as well. So a lot of you guys might be confused about this inclusion because it, doesn't really seem to have a transport, doesn't really seem to have any kind of other support. You don't have Doom in the list via Eldrad and things, but this unit is strictly in the list for combat screening and also for utility. So what I mean by that is Howling Banshees have the fight's first ability. And this means that when they get charged, they actually attack first. Now, at 70 points, that's pretty good. At 85 points, you could always argue that, it wasn't really that great. They didn't trade well with a lot of units that would charge into them. But at 70 points, you can have these guys in your backfield turn 1, and if your opponent manages to sneak something by your screening units, your infiltrators and things like that, maybe they have a very fast unit with fly or, something like that you maybe can't screen out on turn 2 or whatever it is, you can prevent your Falcons in your backfield from getting tied up in close combat with a simple heroic intervention. The Banshees then can come in and clean house. So that's one way to use them. The other way to use them is something I like to call Falcon Olympics. And basically, as you've noticed in this list, we have multiple aspect warriors who really do benefit from being in a Falcon. And depending on the situation, I can have any of those units hop in the Falcon and then later come out in the next turn. One of these units is Howling Banshees. So if my opponent doesn't have a lot of, fast moving melee units or, combat units that I need to screen against, I can always move the Banshees into the Falcon at some point in the battle. And then the Howling Banshees, of course, get a greater threat range the next turn. So, being able to disembark 3 inches, also being able to move 8, advance up to 6 on top of that, and charge in is extremely powerful. It essentially allows the Howling Banshees to clear more than half of the board in a single turn. Is extremely powerful. It essentially allows the Howling Banshees to clear more than half of the board in a single turn. But of course, if you don't want to do that, you can also just throw them in strategic reserve, have them come in on a turn where your opponent is least expecting it via rapid ingress. They're also really good at doing this, and because of their new point cost, they trade way better with a lot more units. I also, of course, have 1 unit of Shadow Specters. This is down to, I should say, 3 units that I had in this list before. And the reason I still want at least one of these units in my list is due to the fact that they can score Capture Enemy Outpost in the first turn with their movement and their shooting combined. So I'm still including 1 unit in my army as a flex option, and realistically speaking, even if I don't draw that on the first turn, they're still a good unit overall, right? They have consistent damage over the course of the game, and I don't really lose anything by taking them in my army, at least 1 unit at least. So I don't really lose anything by taking them. Shroud Runners are also in the list because they have fantastic synergy with a majority of the aspect warriors that I'm bringing, just because lots of volume of fire, lethal hits works really well with this. So, obviously Shroud Runners are going to be a good pick regardless. Shroud Runners are also a good secondary specialist, so they can score secondary objectives quite easily as well. I also have a couple of units of Skyweavers in this list, and some of you might be thinking that this is a weird choice because I already have a lot of anti-large units, Fire Dragons, Falcons, Fuegan, etc. But there's a lot of armies out there right now with very tough tanks, especially Imperial tanks, which have smoke, getting that benefit of cover, and also, getting -1 to hit is really tough to deal with. And sometimes Fire Dragons and Falcons are just not going to be enough to cut it. So I brought in some Skyweavers for backup. The other thing is, if I go against an army that has some very heavy infantry, some high value heavy infantry like aggressors or something like that, and I want to use my Fire Dragons to take that unit out, in the same turn, I'm also not going to be able to realistically take out a vehicle. So I included the Skyweavers in my list because 2 units of Skyweavers should, on average, be able to kill pretty much any vehicle. Aside from things like Land Raiders maybe, or, tougher vehicles like Monoliths, but they still should deal a fair bit of damage to them. And maybe put them in range for some other things to, destroy it. Maybe not heavy, anti-large units, but, some of my other units just, getting lethal hits, with the Shroud Runners or something like that. So it kind of gives me options, kind of gives me some flexibility on what I can destroy in any given turn. Now, something else not to be underestimated is the Star Bolas. Star Bolas are pretty good against heavy infantry, Marine equivalent opponents, but they're also good at dealing with light vehicles, and they can chip a few wounds off of heavy vehicles as well. Being strength 7 means that even against toughness 12, they're wounding on a 5+, which is good, right? You can maybe force a couple more saves on there, and between the Star Bolas and the Haywire, you should be able to kill even the most heavy tanks. In this list, I also have 2 units of Scorpions. Now, a lot of people are going to be running Scorpions in tournament lists. I'm just going to say that now. Being 65 points means they're extremely efficient. They trade very well with a lot of other enemy infantry, especially in the early game, other infiltrators, stuff like that. The Scorpions will clean up very nicely. The other thing I like about striking Scorpions is they deal good ship damage to mounted units and infantry units alike. So if there's a very tough unit in your opponent's army that you don't know if you can one round with your other aspect warriors without exposing too much, you can use your striking Scorpions to not only delay them, charge them, and perhaps even deal a couple wounds, but make them easier targets for later in the game. And of course, needless to say, striking Scorpions make a good screen early on in the game, and they make a good unit to tie up enemy vehicles. I also have 2 units of Swooping Hawks in this list. Again, we're going to aim to have about 4 to 6 units of secondary specialists in the list, and Swooping Hawks, even at 80 points, are still very effective, so chose to still put a couple of those in this army as well. We also have a unit of Warp Spiders in this army, primarily to be a denial and secondary objective tool, but also, it's a good unit to finish things off because they do have devastating wounds. So on average dice, you probably get about 3, devastating wounds, which means about 3 wounds out of any target in the game, barring those that have feel no pain. And because of their 24-inch movement, they can do a lot of different things on the battlefield and really keep your opponent on their toes. Lastly, they're good at area denial because their Overwatch is good too, right? Because they have torrent weapons, they can easily deal about an average of 3 more wounds to any target coming close. That includes things like Inceptors, which on average dice will kill about 1 and throw your opponent's math off when trying to target your other aspect warriors. To round out the list, we have 2 units of Wind Riders, both 3-man units to keep them small, agile, and of course able to score secondaries if they need to, right? One of the things about this list that you'll notice is there's a lot of units in it that overlap roles. And this is on purpose because if my opponent tries to go after something and eliminate something right off the bat, I have backups in spades. For example, if my opponent tries to use their indirect to kill both of my units of Swooping Hawks turn 1, then I can easily use Shadow Specters, or I could use Warp Spiders, or I could use Wind Riders to also score on objectives. Wind Riders also happen to have very good damage against a plethora of targets, not only light vehicles, but also heavy infantry like Marine equivalents, and also orcs because of the feel no pain, right? Because they have damage too, they're very able to get past that 5+ feel no pain that orc boys have, or in some cases even orc knobs. And while I'm not saying 2 units of Wind Riders is going to eliminate a whole orc knob unit, it will significantly damage them to the point where your other units can more easily deal with them and handle them. The last thing to remember about these guys is because of their small bases, they're actually pretty good at stealing objectives. If your opponent doesn't watch out, these guys can fire and fade on the back of a primary objective, and because they have OC6, they can actually take it from your opponent. So that's pretty cool as well, and something to obviously keep safe in your back pocket. Okay, so there's the list, but that's not the only thing you have to do, right? Even a list that looks good on paper is prone to, adjustments. So after making the list, you need to practice with it to get a good feel for how the units interact in it. For example, the last list I just brought up has a lot of units that interact in very sometimes complex ways, right? So you have to really get it on the table to see how it functions together. Getting some practice games in with a buddy who is also going to the tournament is a very good way to get multiple reps in, so you don't have to fully finish the games you play, Play to turn 3, play to turn 4, don't play the full game out, talk out the rest of the turns, and then, re-rack, set yourself up for another game. And that way you can kind of see what's working in the list and what's not, what you can cut or add to the list accordingly without, spending weeks and weeks and weeks playing full games out, And to give you guys an example, sometimes when I'm trying a new list or, a new concept and my buddies may be trying something too, we like to get together and just, agree to play at least 3 games to turn 3 in a single afternoon. And that usually gives me a really good idea of what the list is capable of, what I need to swap out, and what I need to add in or what's missing. And guys, once that's done, once you have the play testing done, stuff like that, you're pretty much good to go. And of course, last but not least, don't stress yourself out. And definitely go into the tournament with a positive growth mindset. And I know a lot of you guys have stress and anxiety, especially at these bigger events. You don't know all these people. There's a certain allure to a tournament, but there's also a certain kind of fear that tournaments bring on. What if I get the rules wrong? What if my opponent's a dick? Stuff like that. Those thoughts kind of creep into our mind a little bit. But it's best to shove those thoughts aside because stress actually causes the thinking process to falter, and poor decisions are more commonly made with people that are suffering a lot of anxiety or stress in certain situations. And that's just science, guys. Coming from a teacher's perspective, I'm telling you right now, the thing that sinks my students the most is stress and test anxiety. I will have students that do perfectly well in their assignments. They get A's, they know exactly what they're doing. And then when it comes to a test that's high stakes, in their opinion, they do poorly on it because they have a lot of testing anxiety and stress. Don't let that happen to you. Just simply do your best, have fun, and just keep in mind that it's all a learning process. You might make mistakes, but that's okay because with the growth mindset, that mistake is actually a positive. It may lose you the game, but it's something to learn for next time, and it's going to make you a better player overall. So in conclusion, tournaments can be a very fun experience, but require some preparation to do well, especially against the better players at the event. And there are going to be players that are tryhards there, and not to say that, tryharding is necessarily a bad thing, because, if they're not cheating, if they're playing by the rules and stuff like that, then, they're there to enjoy the game in their own way. And I think that's totally fine. Sometimes I have a penchant to be a little bit of a tryhard in games, to be honest. Right? Just to be honest with you guys, when I'm going up against a player who's prepping for a tournament, has a very competitive list maybe, I do try my best to win. Obviously not through, BS reasons or, methods, but I try to win and do the best that I possibly can. And I think in a way we all do that, but it's going to be especially prevalent at tournaments. So above all, have fun, go into it with the goal of having a good time and learning as much as you can, and just enjoy yourself, because you will have a much better experience and you'll actually do much better. You'll perform much better. Your decision-making process will be much better if you go into it with that state of mind. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. If I missed anything that you guys can think about, please put it in the comment section below. Maybe something you guys do to prepare for a tournament, maybe your favorite mixtape. Look at how old I am talking about mixtapes. But, maybe your favorite song or something like that to pump you up before a tournament. Let me know in the comment section below. I would absolutely love to hear what the community does to prepare for these events. And thank you so much to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community. I'm very active on the Discord, as are many other great Eldar players. So definitely join us if you can, and I will leave the link in the description for that. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page. So if you want to support the channel through those means, grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon or some, Eldar inspired apparel on my channel store page. I will leave the links down in the description as well. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.